Hey guys, John here, and yes, Pigments is back by popular demand, and I also missed Pigments as well. So we're going to do a Pigments week, and I think to kick off Pigments week, what we should do is talk a little bit about the Combinate tab. So the pink one down over here. So this tab is probably more neglected than my emotional well-being, which says quite a lot about this Combinate tab. So when we click this, it can be kind of daunting. We kind of say like, okay, what is this doing? We're combinating what's happening here. So if you've gone through the course that I've done, you probably are a little bit more familiar with Combinate, but if you haven't, let's talk a little bit about it. So the whole concept is basically combining two different modulation sources. And here on the bottom, there's different types or different ways we can do that. So let's focus first here on crossfade. It'll kind of make a little bit more sense, but we have a lot of different stuff. So we have adding or sum, the difference, multiplication, divide, lag, threshold, so on and so forth. But for now, for today's video, let's just focus on crossfade because it's probably the easiest concept here to understand. So what we can do is get two different modulation sources and kind of blend them together to make a third one. So for example, we have an init preset here with the analog engine. So just a saw wave, and let's bring this guy in here as well. And maybe the third one here, and maybe drop this guy down an octave, so -12 semitones. And let's give it a little bit of fine tuning. And maybe a little bit of unison. Oh yeah. Okay, there we go. So let's go to our keyboard here, or our envelopes, and give it a little bit of release. Okay, so we have a pretty decent patch, right? A lot of oscillators going on, some unison. So now let's focus on the Combinate tab. So let's do something with the filter. So normally, let's say if we had like an envelope and we drag and drop here, we have some modulation like that, and it's basically this shape of this envelope too. So this guy, which is moving the filter, so pretty obvious, right? So let's double click and remove that. So let's take a look at Combinate. So we're going to be doing crossfade here, and for the first source, let's check out the first LFO. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine two different LFOs together, and you're going to kind of see how this works out. So the first LFO is this guy, and you'll see how this is basically doing exactly like the first LFO is doing. And now this one's activated because we're selecting it here in the Combinate tab. So far so good. So it's basically just doing the LFO. So if we were to drag this Combinate here on the cutoff, it's literally doing the exact same thing as LFO1. So let's look at this guy, and instead of hertz, let's go to sync, and maybe let's go to something like, I don't know, 1/4. Okay, so we have something like this. Now, what we're going to do is combine the second LFO. Now, for this first one, instead of making this bipolar, so going back and forth, and so like instead of just negative and positive values, let's just do positive. So in bipolar, let's click this to unipolar. So it's just kind of going above this line right here. Okay, so now we like this shape. It's kind of a cool sine wave, just kind of bouncing back and forth, moving this cutoff here. So now in the LFO2, what we can do is go to this rate. Let's go over to sync as well. Let's make this one faster. So let's see, what do we have here? 1/4. So maybe let's go 1/8, and this guy is going to be a saw wave, right? So now we can go to the Combinate tab, and on the second mod over here, let's click this, and let's go to LFO2. Now it looks the exact same. We see a unipolar LFO that's a sine wave just kind of going. But once we start adding this amount in here, we can start seeing these jagged things going here. So what's happening is that it's basically doing this LFO, the sine wave for the first one, but also introducing the spiky, the saw wave into the second one. So now if we want to make this a little bit more interesting, we can go, instead of 1/4, let's go 1/... Let's do, what can we do? Let's go straight only because there's too many values. Let's go 1/2, so half. Now this is interesting because if we look at the shape here, all the way to the left, it's just a slow LFO going, and we start increasing this, and we see the spikes here. So this is really cool because not only do we get the syncing of the first LFO at 1/2, but we also get the second one, which if you remember here, it is going to be 1/8. So we get both of those rhythmic motions and creating a whole new shape right here. And if we go all the way to the right, then we basically have LFO2, so the same thing there. But once we start blending them, it's actually really, really cool. So in this sense, we could technically put two different mods on it, and it kind of gets a little convoluted, but adding them here is really interesting. And this is just a crossfade. So this is one type of doing that we can go to sum, which is obviously going to be summing. It's going to be a little bit different than the first one that we chose. Then we can go to difference. Now that one's actually kind of cool as well. So it's not such a scary tab. I highly recommend to go through these different types here because you're going to get some really interesting stuff there. Crossfade is probably the most straightforward of what you're going to get, and then you kind of toggle this amount knob to see how much of source 1 you want and how much of source 2. Now, this is just dealing with the two LFOs. If you click this list, there's a lot of stuff to go through. So you can almost go into two functions and add those two together, go into your functions tab and make some crazy shapes here, and then start adding the second one into that. So there's going to be really a lot of possibilities for those. So if we click this guy here, we have a lot of different stuff. We can do stuff with the velocity, aftertouch, mod wheel. So kind of start thinking of this as well. And we also have macros. So it gets a little bit in depth. I know it's kind of more of the advanced side of pigments, but keep in mind, sometimes, after we're using pigments for so long, I guess so many years, depending on how long you've used it, and you kind of feel maybe you've gotten to a point where you kind of feel like you've mastered it, then you should probably go start attacking these Combinate tabs, because a lot of the other modulation sources aren't too complex or hard to wrap your brain around. We have our envelopes, which are pretty basic stuff, or LFOs, again, pretty basic. And then our functions, which are kind of just like a different term for, an MSEG or something like that, just a multifunctional LFO or envelope, depending on how you set it up. Then we have randoms, which obviously it's just a random modulation signal, and we have a couple different versions of those. And then once you get all of these down in your head, and these are pretty much second nature, then go into the Combinate tab and say, okay, what kind of interesting modulation sources could I add together and kind of mix into those? So that's kind of stage one. Stage two, which is kind of interesting. So we have Combinate 1, and we're making this out of LFO 1 and 2, right? So now we have that in our head. What we can also do is if we go to Combinate 2, then we can go to our type. Let's say, I don't know, maybe let's go back to crossfade. And then for our source, we can select Combinate 1. So now we have this signal in here in the second one. So LFO 1 and LFO 2 are being crossfaded into Combinate 1 as a modulation source. And then we bring that into Combinate 2 for the first source. And then now we have this modulation, which is something entirely different. So let's say we can go to function 1 or something like that, and kind of bring this in here, and maybe function 1, let's kind of just make some weird shapes here. I don't know, some kind of strange like that. Maybe make some weird curves. I don't know, just something weird and obscure. And then we go to this combination tab, and then we have this. So what the heck is this thing? So that might be kind of an interesting shape that's kind of random, but kind of not in the same sense, because it's still going to be repeating the same shapes between LFO 1 combined together and then adding whatever that source is to function 1. So if we double click this and remove that, and then we go into Combinate 2 and drag and drop this guy. We're kind of getting, like I said, a random modulation signal that's not entirely random, because a lot of the times in sound design or synthesis, we can kind of predict what the modulation is going to be. Okay, we have an envelope that's obviously going to live its quick life cycle, and then we have our LFOs, which is just like a reoccurring sine wave, triangle wave, whatever it's going to be, square wave. We kind of can almost guess what those modulation movements are going to be. And modulation is probably one of the most important things, because it's the movement of our patch, it's the movement of our sound, and that really makes things interesting. So having a shape like this that's still in sync, not in sync, but in sync, and it's still kind of weird. It's not really that predictable of a shape, but after a while, you'll kind of start getting the rhythm of it, and it'll be really super interesting. So definitely check out these combination tabs. Don't shy away from them. I know you probably do. We've all done it. We're kind of like, ugh, the combination tabs. Yeah, let's just save that for another day. But don't save it for today and make some interesting shapes out of those, because it is a lot of fun. And again, we have combinate 1, 2, and then if we went to crossfade again, we can go here and select combinate 2 and bring this into combinate 3 and do something, I don't know, random 1, and then see what it spits out. You can get some really interesting shapes there. So yeah, play around with it. Hopefully you learn something in this one. And like everything in the world, the best way to learn something is to actually put it into practice. It's one thing to watch this video and kind of say, okay, I kind of get the concept, but actually do it yourself and you'll start moving things around and kind of learning on your own that way a little bit better, I think. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.